Mutz, November 7th, 1995, being interviewed by Leah Zazuyer in Rochester, New York, USA in English. You were talking about the couple.
Yeah, as we were approaching the compound, Mrs. Bitkova was on one side of the road, and Mr. Bitkova was on the other side, bleeding. Each one got 2 shots to the head, and Schomburger executed him. Word had it at that time, the reason for this was that they went to complain to him how bad things are, and if this condition exists for much longer, there will be no one left. And he wanted to have no part of it. So he went ahead and he simply executed him. Of course, I was not an eyewitness to the discussion, but this is what word had it afterwards. Another incident that took place there was a 5 or 6 year old little boy. I was already the growing up at that time. And one day he spotted him, Schomburger it is. He went after him, took him out, and took him behind the barracks and simply executed him. So that's the sort of thing he practiced all along, and he thrived on it. He would bring his henchmen in and have a big party, and they'd come in and take some people out and shoot him. One of the daily occurrences was there was a dispensary. If you could no longer walk, they usually would carry you to the dispensary, where you were allowed to stay 2 days. On the 3rd day, they would come in and toss you onto a horse-drawn wagon and take you out to a nearby village, which was only maybe at the most 2 miles from camp, and summarily execute you. This was done on a daily basis, and there were 2 guys that were doing the executing. One of them was Schomburg himself, and the other guy was Zimmerman. Zimmerman was one of the known executioners there. He was a tall, lanky individual wearing his black uniform almost on a daily basis, his head cocked to the side, and he would think of nothing. My father, may he rest in peace, he was in the tailor shop, and he quite often was called to perform digging the graves or halls, and of course covering them. So sometimes he said, well, today they killed this guy, this guy, and this guy. Oh, he says, today, he says, they killed 12 of them. Oh, they brought in, he says, a couple of women, they must have captured them on the outside. He says, there was just, he says, 2 young girls that he did away with. This went on for the duration of my being in concentration camp Yelets. And it wasn't concentration camp Yelets that I got tattooed. They did this specifically to enable you to escape, because there were non-Jews working in the factory too, and they were allowed to go home. So when they passed through the checkpoint or through that gate, usually they'd make them roll up their sleeves to show that they were not tattooed. One of the things that I remember, this happened to one of the individuals that we knew quite well. He was liberated, but he only lived about 6 weeks after the liberation. He's being tattooed right in front of me. Got the tattoo on the arm, and the guy looks at him. He says, "Are you married?" The guy says, "Yes." He says, "Where's your wife?" He says, I don't know. He says, "I hope she's someplace." He says, "So you're married?" He says, "Yeah." He takes his ring finger and he puts that tattoo on his finger. Well, he says, now you know you're married. He says, before you leave, next thing, he tattooed the Star of David on his forehead. Well, anything to humiliate, degrade, and torture. That was his forte. That was his daily job. And every so often, he would let his dog Prince loose on a prisoner. And he'd stay there and wait until all the screaming and crying and yelling would subside. And the dog would come back a bloody mess. He says, Prince, he says, I'm proud of you. He says, you've done a very good job. He says, tomorrow we'll give you another Jew.
You don't have a number? It's
No. In Mielec, there were no numbers given. Just this.
Can you describe it?
Yeah. KL, which is in German means Konzentrationslager, which literal translation is concentration camp.
And when you were there, now you were around 11?
When I was in Mielec, I got to Mielec in 43. I was 13 already.
13.
But all throughout the time, from the time the Germans came in, it was a constant struggle on the move, a constant struggle for survival, a constant witnessing of torture, execution. And, it was just unbelievable what these people did. It cannot be described in words. As I sit here now and talk about it, it's difficult for me to imagine that I'm actually here.
You went back and forth 3 times to your city of origin.
Twice.
All told.
Yeah, initially when we got exiled in 39, then to Mielec, then from Mielec back to Tarnobrzeg.
Do you know why you were sent back and forth like that?
The third time it was by sheer coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
The second time because my dad wanted to be in the city of his birth, because he was well known as a tailor and it was easier for him to make a living in this city and from the surrounding communities. That's this reason we went there the second time. And the first time we got exiled to Radomyśl and then made our way to Mielec and then back to Tarnobrzeg.
Was this because the Germans were moving people around for some particular reason, or was it random?
Most of the time it was specifically designed to shock individuals. They would single out a group and put them in with another group of people, and there's an adjustment period. You know, you get to know some people and you find some strength from one another, some moral support. That's one of the main reasons for them doing this. And the other reason is, well, let's enlarge this camp because we have some labor for them. Even though the labor may be meaningless, but this guy wants to save his own neck, not to be sent to the Russian front. So he wants to show that he's in charge of this and they're doing this for the German Reich. And this is his war effort. And so this was another reason why it was commonly done.
Do you think that your father's tailoring skills are specifically the reason that he was allowed to go back?
Yes, that was one of the main reasons. If you were a tailor, a shoemaker, a tanner, or had some sort of a skill, which they felt they could make use of, then you had a better chance of survival than some of the people that were educated and they had no use for. If you were educated, they just as soon do away with you because they strongly felt if you have some sort of an education, you may offer some form of leadership.
When you had typhus, did you have medication or?
I had no medication when I came down with typhoid. I was pretty well done, and that was in town object. And one of the customers that my father did quite a bit of tailoring tossed in a jar of raspberry syrup. And I don't know if it was strictly due to my body resistance, but once I start taking that raspberry syrup, I was beginning to feel better within a day or two.
Hmm. So you were in Mielec for how long?
I was in Mielec for almost a year. And from Mielec, when the Russians started to come closer to Mielec, we heard some artillery shots being fired. They pulled a train in and loaded all the Jews up in the cattle car and brought us into a camp which was known as Wieliczka. Wieliczka was a salt mine. And what they tried to do is set up some machine shops to machine parts for airplanes in the salt mines. But what little one knows is machinery in the salt mine within a couple of days, unless it's used and practically baited in oil, will begin to rust. So that did not last too much time. We stayed in Wieliczka a short time, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And there the daily executions were similar to that in Mielec. There was, I remember one instance where some Ukrainian guard let his machine pistol loose at night into the barracks. And there must have been, anywhere between 4 and 6 people that got killed, and some of the wounded had to be dragged out in the morning to be held accountable. So we had 2,000. They were just going crazy for having the right amount of people. Yeah, going back to Mielec for a minute, it is Mielec that had my arm broken and my teeth knocked out. And
how did that happen?
It happened when we were marching in from work onto the compound, right at the gate. One of, that was Schwamberger, he stood there with a big long stick or a club, and he was counting. You had to go 10 rows in 4s. And I was the last person on the left side, and he just came around and hauled off, and he broke my arm. And no medical attention whatsoever. I knew the arm was broken because when my dad twisted it, you could hear the bones crunch. Let me just put a piece of board and some twine. I could still go to work, sleeves on, and do my work with my right hand. And then one time I got beat up by one of the troopers, knocked my teeth out. So anyway, going back to Wieliczka, we stayed there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then the Germans were being chased out from Poland. They placed us in cattle cars and hauled us into Auschwitz. I was never in Auschwitz proper. We were on the track, sitting in the railroad cars, on the box cars. And every day they would glide the doors open, and whoever had succumbed would get tossed out. They came in with a 2-wheeled push cart, 2 big husky guys, and when they loaded this wagon up, tossed a belt around it and took them away to camp. And after staying there for almost 4 days, we was sitting in these cars, and I see one morning, one of the SS sergeant running over to the locomotive. He climbs up and he yells out to the conductor, see to it that this garbage is taken away from here, so we don't even have enough time or place to burn it. And within a few hours later, train pulled out, and they brought us into Flossenburg. This was the last camp that I spent my time incarcerated. In Flossenburg, the daily routine was, again, 6 in the morning till 6 at night. Barely any food, let alone clothing. And the factory was around, probably 4 miles away from the compound where we lived. We worked there. The only time one got a little rest if during the night shift. Then when the alarm sounded, Allied planes flying over, they used to cut off the electricity. So it's total dark. So get a little extra sleep at night when we worked night shift. There too, I worked in the machine shop for a very short while, but most of the work there was in the stone quarry, stone mine.
And you say you lived separately from the factory?
Yes, I had to walk to the factory on a daily basis.
What was the living like?
Well, it was living hell. You had triple-decker bunks, just wooden logs, and the only thing that helped out if you could secure a place to sleep under the bed, so they couldn't quite readily reach you there. Most of the time, there were no windows in these barracks, and used to get extremely cold in Flossenburg. It's in the valley. One time I remember one of the persons had succumbed, and I wound up sleeping on the top tier. And one of the guys says to me, he says, this guy is quite cold. So the guy says, yeah, I think he's dead. So picked him up and just tossed him down to the floor. And the edict was, if they find you dead on the floor, they'd bring you into the washroom, which was the toilets. And then they would come around and take him to the crematorium and burn him. My brother got killed there. He got beaten to death.
So he was not sent to Treblinka with your mother?
No, my brother was older. When they were selecting Jews on this pasture in Dembitz, he wound up in another camp by the name Rzeszów, which was around 70 kilometers from where we were. While we were in Tarnobrzeg, in this camp, there was one individual. He used to be our neighbor. His name was Warszawski, and the father of this Abraham Warszawski wound up in Rzeszów. And he found out that his father is in Tarnobrzeg, so he escaped from Rzeszów, walked at night and hid in the woods during the day. And when he finally rejoined his father in Tarnobrzeg in the camp where we were, this guy, Paluch, the guy that was in charge of this camp, well, he says, I don't remember seeing you around here. He says, yes, I was in Rzeszów, he says, but I wanted to be with my father. That's why I escaped from Rzeszów, and I'm here now. He says, well, that's good. He says, I'm glad to have you. 2 hours later, the Gestapo came in and took this 14-year-old. He's a couple of years older than I was. They took him out and summarily executed him. He says, that's what you get for escaping.
So you were reunited with your brother at Flossenburg? Or?
And unbeknown to us, my brother was on the same train from Rzeszów onto Flossenburg. And when we got to Flossenburg, someone that knew my brother and knew my father said, you know, he says, I saw, he says, your son here, to my father. And I said, where'd you see him? I said, saw him on block number 7. So I went up there on Sunday afternoon. That's the only time we were allowed to go out from these barracks. And there was my brother, and that's where we were reunited in Flossenburg. Mm. But he got beaten by one of the capos, and he never made it. It's, I don't know if it was by sheer intuition. I saw my brother on a Sunday afternoon. He says, you know, he says, I will never make it. He says, they killed me here. And I said, don't worry, the war will be over soon. You'll be fine. And I had to leave. And I ran back down on Tuesday, early in the morning, and I see there's a figure in that bed on that bunk where my brother was. His blanket pulled over his head, and I peeled the blanket back, and I says, what was this guy that was here? He says, I don't know. He says, I've been here, he says, now for an hour. So when I came here, he says, the bunk was empty, so I just, he says, got here. And I ran into the washroom to see if my brother was still there, and he was no longer there. Then I chased down the people that were gathering up the dead bodies with the push cart, that two-wheeler, and I couldn't find my brother there. The crematorium was set up in such a way where they had a sliding board and just tipped the push cart, and they would slide the bodies into it and burn it. And when I got to it, my brother was being slid down.
So you saw that. Mm-hmm. Had your father had a chance to meet with him?
Yes, once.
Mm-hmm. He said he thought he wouldn't live for
that
for
was
what reason?
his intuition. He says, you know, I will not make it out of here. He says, living hell, and I'll just as soon, he says, not do it.
You mentioned being in the cattle cars outside of Auschwitz for 4 days. I wanted to just ask you a little bit about those 4 days.
Well, it was in August of '44, and the heat was just unbearable. The doors, they would slide open once a day to remove the dead bodies. Quite often the dead bodies were used as benches to sit on, and the stench, the filth, was unbelievable. And we just sat there, recited prayers. And in the mornings when they were sliding the doors open, they would bring in a bucket of water and 3 or 4 loaves of bread. If you happened to be right near the door, you were able to secure some food. Or if you had someone that you knew or your relative, they would share it with you, like my father quite often did. And those were usually the common means of transport of the Jews, wherever they were gathered. And most of the time, they headed for places of incarceration or extermination.
What do you think the temperature was like in those
cattle cars?
Mm-hmm.
Extremely hot. I wouldn't be a bit surprised that the temperature at that time reached around 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, centigrade.
Which is?
Oh, which is in the high 90s.
Mm-hmm. You said you worked in the stone quarry in Flossenburg. That must have been quite a job. Can you describe it?
Yeah, Flossenburg is located in Bavaria. The reason they out in no man's land, there's nothing near it, and they picked this place specifically because of the beautiful granite that is mined from there. When I was there in that particular time, Flossenburg held around 20,000 prisoners. And there you were not identified by name, you were identified by number. I remember when we first got there in August of '44, they had us march around in the nude for about 2 weeks and sleep outside. And they called this the processing time. And then, as I mentioned, initially we worked in the machine shops, and then when things started to fall apart, they had no tools, they had no replacement of parts for the machinery. Then the labor force was directed to do mining in the stone quarries. By the way, when I was there recently, the same guy that owned it before World War II and during the time that I was there still owns it now.
So were you digging or lifting or?
I was lifting.
Dragging?
I was lifting. And another common practice that the SS did in Flossenburg, the barracks were on steps. You had about 20 steps and then 2 rows of barracks, another 20 steps, another 2 rows of barracks. When it was cold, what they would do is stay on top of the last steps and pour water on the steps. And that would freeze within a matter of a few minutes. Then they made the prisoners mount those steps in wooden clods. And if you slid down and fell down and slid down to the bottom, they would stay there on the bottom and beat you to death. Screaming and yelling that you were too stupid to even walk up the steps. There was another one of those goodies thrown in, which was part of the torture system.
So Flossenburg was a labor camp, but it was more than a labor camp.
Well, extermination camp, labor camp, the end result was always the same. These two terms are synonymous, and they're just about impossible to separate as distinct functions. If you take an individual and subject him to the type of degradation and the type of treatment. Now, if the person lives a month, or lives 3 months, or lives 6 months, that's highly dependent on his personal makeup, on his physique. But the end result is always the same. He's being exterminated.